For the next session, it's going to be the professor and Sandeep, and I'll let you two have the floor.
May I just start with a general statement? Last year, and I see many faces around who were here last year, we had Tom Szabo. His name was just mentioned, and Silver Axe is his website. Now, Tom Szabo is a Hungarian like myself. I like him. He's a young man, very energetic, not the best of speakers. In other words, he is not so...
Very technical.
Well, all right.
He was technical.
All right, yeah.
His attribute was technicality.
And he assumes that everybody is in perfect command of all. Now, I have supported Tom over the years. I have invited him to come to Hungary at a session of the Gold Standard University Live, which existed then, no longer exists, but we have this wonderful Gold Standard Institute here. Then I have invited him for a consultation with an American who lives in Alabama. That's not very important, but I told this wealthy American who had certain worries about hedging and so on, that I have the theory, but when it comes to practice, I'm not on the firmest of ground. So please invite this young man who is much more conversant with the technicalities of hedging and so on. So he did invite, and he invited Tom, and he came to Alabama, and for a couple of days we had a good private consultation. And there were other instances. I just mentioned this because I thought I could expect Tom to have a little bit of loyalty. Now, I was disappointed. I just say this because I think that when we are discussing theory and practice, we should try to remove our personal feelings from it, because the motivation is finding the truth. So even if sometimes I have to admit that I was wrong, I should do that. Because if I try to pretend that I'm always right, it's not going to be helpful in the long run. So what happened was that Sandeep spotted the backwardation in December last year, and he communicated it to me, and I looked at it, and I liked the argument which Sandeep produced to support this, and went ahead and published several articles on the internet announcing that we have a backwardation. It was not clear that it would be permanent, but there was a possibility it might be. If it's not, then, well, we just have something which is unique, because by that time the length of this backwardation was longer than any previous episode. Now, the way Tom reacted to this was neurotic. He went on his website, Silver Axis, and denounced it in a language which I found not acceptable, especially in view of the fact that we had this former relationship. So I didn't react to it, so I just kept my grievance to myself. But Tom lives in California, San Jose, and I was hoping that when I I was going to go to San Francisco to give a course at the San Francisco School of Economics in July. So I was hoping that we could get together. It's just a few, I don't know, less than 100 miles, San Jose from San Francisco, and we could just shake hands and everything. I didn't even get a phone call from him. No, I didn't feel like taking the initiative. He was younger and so on. So I'm just, I just thought I had to report this to you so that you know. I can recommend Sandeep's research without any reservation. I have studied it. I have compared it with what Tom had to say, already criticized by Sandeep at the earlier talk today, that Tom is taking a theoretical midpoint of the bid and ask for the future and the theoretical midpoint of the bid and ask of the spot, and takes the difference, and that's the basis. Now the problem with this is that, as in the words of Sandeep, which I find admirable, this is a non-actionable trade. It's a theoretical construction which has no practical application, because nobody will sell you the future at a theoretical midpoint, and nobody will buy gold from you at a theoretical midpoint. You have to have a concept which is actionable, and then you can build a theory on it. Otherwise you are building on quicksand. So that's my basic criticism about Tom's construction. I commend Sandeep. This is his idea, the concept of carry and de-carry. This is a brilliant idea. It goes directly to Karl Menger, who in the 19th century introduced this concept that the market never ever produces one single price. It has to be at least two prices, the bid and ask, the lower bid and the higher ask price. And it hardly ever happens that you buy and turn around and sell at the same price. So this idea of a monolithic price is completely unreal. You cannot develop a theory. So this is what has motivated my own work, and I was very pleased to see that Sandeep took it a great step ahead when he introduced this concept in the discussion of the basis and the problem of backwardation and contango. And well, can we say that today we made history because we introduced the other term? So, you see, the same idea, basis, monolithic concept. Menger would come out, get out of his grave and say, gee, after all these years, 130 years,
I've been
you
waiting.
could not learn that there is no such thing as a monolithic concept. So there are at least two basis concepts. One is which is based on the carry, and the other which is based on the de-carry. So we made history today. You hadn't used that before, co-basis.
No.
Could you think of a better word?
I don't think so.
All right. So ladies and gentlemen, concept was born today right here in Canberra. Gold Standard Institute sponsored this meeting, and from now on we are going to use that language in our publications. I am certainly going to do that myself, and I suggest that those who think this is important follow suit. So with this, we open we are planning to have a dialogue here. Okay, I ask questions, Sandy answers, and then vice versa. So I ask the first question, which is connected to his earlier talk. We are expecting an event which hasn't happened, but we are fairly convinced that it's coming. We don't know when. The question is, this event is the permanent backwardation of gold and silver, which means that the basis falls to a negative value, which is already so deep that there is no chance for the basis to bounce back to positive territory. So the question is this: what kind of configuration of the basis and the co-basis could give an early warning that this permanent backwardation is imminent? One he already mentioned, but there are others. So my question to you, Sandeep, is could you repeat the first one which you already explained, and what other configurations of the basis and the co-basis would be as a good signal?
I think I'll go up to the whiteboard.
The eraser is there.
The old presentation, there was one chart. Where is the eraser? Ah. So, we said earlier that basis and co-basis. And just very quick reminder for everyone, the basis was calculated as the future bid minus the spot offer. And the co-basis was the spot bid minus future offer. And we said that in a normal market, the basis would be like this, as in a fully carrying market, and the co-basis will be negative. Now, firstly, you're in 2 dimensions here as opposed to 1 dimension, which is a help. But there are many different ways in which the interaction could happen before you go into permanent backwardation. So, what could happen? First clue, the obvious clue the most obvious clue is obviously if the co-basis goes positive. But there are interactions that can happen which might lead and be a precursor to the co-basis going positive. So you could have that the basis starts falling, turns negative, but there is still no actionable profit on the co-basis spread. So the basis starts falling, is one clue, independent of what the co-basis is doing. Now, that is scenario 1. Let's label that 1. There's another scenario 2. This will eventually lead on. It could lead on to something like this. But there is still no actionable profit on the co-basis, but there is no actionable profit on the basis either, as in to carry or to decarry. That's another scenario. That itself could lead on to the third scenario, which is this. So this is the morphing of a positive carry, a positive basis, a negative co-basis, into a positive co-basis and a negative basis. So what are the clues to watch out for? Well, the carry falling, the basis falling, both being negative. Now, this is the final outcome, permanent backwardation. But if we see the topology of the curves remaining, let's say from that position which we are at the moment, with this, we could move from this and be in a state where we are in this form for a lengthy period of time, you know, where you can't actually action a trade via the code basis, but you cannot carry it either. So that would be your first clue that you're going to be going into a situation of permanent backwardation, or maybe not a permanent backwardation, but at least a backwardation. If you resort from having a state like this to this. Now, the move to this, as we had in December, was not permanent, because we moved from this state to this state to this state very, very quickly in December. And after January, we remained in this state. So it could revert back to either that state again, or it could revert back to that state. So it turned out that it actually reverted back to the first state without going back to the third state. So is that clear to everyone? Yeah? So there are three different topologies that you should watch for. This one, the regular one, let's call this regular. Let's call this slightly irregular. And call this irregular proper.
Irregular proper. Is that an oxymoron?
Any questions? Really?
Could there be another one where the two lines are above the line, both the co-basis and the basis are positive? I'm just curious.
There could be. That would be slightly more unlikely though, because if the co-basis has gone positive, it's unlikely that you'll be able to carry it positively as well. So, if you're looking, you will not spot any of this, obviously, if you're looking at the midpoints of the
Irregular, improper.
yeah, you know, it will just be constantly regular, and then, you know, it might not be regular, but there's no special definition to when you're looking at the midpoints of, when you're looking at arbitrary midpoints of, you know, two contracts, there's nothing that you can really say there. So let's go back to the last chart that I didn't show. Yeah. Okay, so the red line here is the basis, carry, and the blue line is the co-basis, the D carry. So you can see here, this is March time, just after we'd had the correction, just after the December backwardation. Both of them were still very negative. So the carry, the basis was negative, and the co-basis was negative. Now you have to ignore these sharp spikes here. That represents contract expiry, where you're looking at the quotients of two things that are approaching zero. So you can ignore, you shouldn't ignore it if they're spiking up, but as they're spiking down, you can ignore them. So you can see that the market was in the slightly irregular form all the way here. Okay, I need to add a little addendum to the slightly irregular. Let's call it 2A. Where you have that. So you can either have basis above the co-basis or the co-basis above the basis. Both in negative territory. So you can see that it was actually quite psychotic, the gold market, as long as you're excluding the contract expiries. Nevertheless, in between, we were still quite psychotic. Look at the way that the basis and the co-basis were behaving here, and here, and here. And then all of a sudden, we reverted with the December contract back to a regular state, the first one. So what will I be looking for here? I'll be looking for that to morph into one of these three other formations, one of these to particularly before we move back to an irregular proper situation in the gold market. Now that might be permanent, it might not be permanent. But the precursors will be when we have either 2 or 2A happening, leading on to form 3, which is the irregular. Co-basis being positive and the basis being negative. Yeah.
It seems like we're in a phase, like a transition, you know, in terms of bifurcation, move into the next phase. The water boiling, for instance, just at 95, 98 degrees, just before it turns to steam, is highly disorderly. And it seems like that's what is happening now.
It did seem like
To and
that.
from this slightly irregular, which could actually move back into the regular, which did happen, but this toing and froing between regular, slightly irregular and irregular proper.
There is no
could
irregular
actually
proper.
move in this cycle for a while before it moves to that permanent backwardation phase.
Now, there is no irregular proper on this graph here, apart from
That's right. That period
Yeah.
before, yes.
which was actually, you know, the end of the December move.
That's right.
And you could argue a bit here, but it didn't last very long.
So essentially, what you're trying to say is that it's only that period in the last phase that you've got the box around that is indicating leading into 2A or 2B, or 2 or 2A, that might lead to a trade.
Yes, yes. But the fact that it's gone from one of these two to the regular phase is the trading opportunity as well.
It's carrying.
You know?
Yeah.
And it should be, you know, not biased towards the long side, basically. Because a sustainable rally will have the opposite occurring at some point in permanent backwardation. Now, if that were to change, and I know there were some pieces today talking about gold going into backwardation and silver getting, I don't think they are by my calculations. If that were to change, then the stance would change, because we would obviously go from a regular state to a quasi-irregular state and maybe an irregular state proper, but we aren't doing that just yet. Is this all clear? All clear? Right.
Okay, your turn to ask me the question.
How long do you think it will be, Professor, before we do go into permanent backwardation?
I would hesitate to be definite in answering this question, because certain things are not all that clear to my mind. I can put my finger on the reason why backwardation, if the basis is negative enough, is not going to recover, so to speak, because the equilibrating mechanism is completely missing. So let me just put myself in the position of a warehouseman. What message does a negative basis, deep enough, mean to him? What message does it carry to him? Well, the warehouseman would be tempted to sell, right? The spot price is high enough, attractive enough. However, he doesn't know, and he is more and more suspicious that he will never ever be able to replenish his stock. So he could empty his warehouse, but then he's out of business. So in other words, he will be forced to become, so to speak, a speculator. Because, you see, all warehousemen work on the principle that they sell on condition that they can replenish their warehouse. I mean, what good is it to sell if that is finishing your business for good? You will never be able to put, after all, a warehouse is also capital. It has to be built, it has to have security, it has to have services, electricity, etc. And if you cannot put it to good use, then your capital it has to be written off. So in other words, I can see that the warehouseman at one point will have to become a speculator on the long side. I mean, obviously he didn't go into this business because he expected to become a speculator. He would have to, he may have his own feelings about the future gold price, but if he is also a speculator, he has to carry an entirely separate account. You know, if he tries to mix his speculative account with his warehousing account, that's a guaranteed failure. It never works that way. So it's not that you cannot wear two hats at the same time, but if you do, you've got to separate the accounts and be very disciplined about this, that you do not let your feeling influence your business decisions. If you are not able to do that, if you don't have the necessary discipline, finished. You are no good. You are going to fail sooner or later. So that is my reading of it, that the warehouseman in the gold business is a kind of schizophrenic enterprise. Schizophrenic because he knows that he has to separate these two, the business of warehousing and speculation, but he is forced by the circumstances, which is this long-term vanishing of the basis, as far back in history as we can take it, 1971. There's no two ways about it. This is what the message is, that the permanent backwardation is coming. So he knows this, but he doesn't want to be schizophrenic, yet circumstances will. So I can see that he will resist, and he tries to be as disciplined as possible under the circumstances. But something has to give as the basis keeps falling. And that's psychology, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to make a psychological prediction.
I disagree a little bit, because to me I do not think there are any pure warehousemen in gold. The bullion banks, or indeed even the mint, not that we would arbitrage this, but all that warehouse gold, they're running two businesses. They can use that warehouse to do warehousing, but they also use it to do allocated storage. So when there is no opportunity for them to carry and make a profit, they will still be recovering their storage costs from the pure allocated, which are the people who are long and not looking to sell at all. So I think that they're not out of business. They're in some sense, and that leads to the next thing, which is if you've got a vault and you've got a whole lot of allocated people in there paying storage fees, then your costs of running that vault are covered. And that means that the cost of actually storing any of your own gold for the purposes of carry is free. So there's actually no cost to carry apart from funding cost for a warehouseman, because their operational costs are covered by those who are repairing the system, doing allocated storage at 1% or whatever.
I see a little confusion here, so let's clarify. what constitutes a warehouseman? Is a warehouseman somebody who rents out storage space with security and so on to private customers, or is he a man who keeps an inventory with the purpose of buying and selling? Or is it a mixture? I'm suggesting it to you that if it's a mixture, the successful warehouseman would have to separate these two activities completely. Because if he mixes them up, then then he cannot say that this arm is profitable, this arm is making a loss. So in order to be able to say that the operation is profitable, you've got to make that separation.
Well, that's true, but I think that in practice what would happen is that the capital decision to build a vault, it would be based on the more stable revenue, which is allocated storage, and the cream to the revenue would be the ability occasionally to do a carry and to operate in that market. But the business model would be, I'm going to build this vault and spend this money, based on the more certain revenue, which is, I know there are always people wanting to store allocated gold at 1%. That's a good stable revenue that pays for my vault, and decarry opportunities are profit, a cream on top of that. And whether they come or go doesn't mean that I'm suddenly out of money and I have to shut my vault and my kids don't have any food. So I think they do mix it up in some sense.
I think that I would define a warehouseman as the person strictly who buys and sells forward, not in.
That's my feeling. That's my feeling. I'm not saying it's impossible to carry on according to Brown's model. It is possible. But if you don't have the discipline to separate the two activities, in the long run you cannot be successful. In other words, for accounting purposes, you've got to consider the two as separate businesses, okay, under the same ownership. But that's like you own a bakery and you own a slaughterhouse at the same time. That's possible. But if you start mixing up baking bread and you have a bloody outcome. That's my feeling. Now, I've never been a warehouseman. I'm just thinking over, trying to put myself in the position, and I've studied the same problem quite extensively in a different context. Glass-Steagall, the name came up one of these days. You see, that was a good legislation in the 1930s because it separated commercial banking from investment banking. You see? And then in 1999, they re-merged the two, and that gave all this possibility to bankers to mix up the two businesses, and as a result, we had a total banking failure in the United States. They are not able to recover from this because they confused the two. So, that's a different example. But it shows the principle which is underlined that, sure, some banks will have even more than two arms. They will have a savings bank, they will have a commercial bank, an investment bank, and maybe even a mortgage bank. But they have to be kept in watertight, separate compartments. Because once you start mixing, it's an invitation to disaster. That's my latest thought on this.
I think there's also a point that, if you are a warehouseman, as we define it, the person who buys spot and sells forward, let's say for 1 year out, there is the question of, is there an alternative use for that inventory in the interim? Now, obviously, with gold and silver, you can lease it out for a premium. But the point is, though, that that is questionable about whether you're being a warehouseman then, because you might not get the gold back before you have to deliver it. And this goes all the way back to sort of Roman contract law about the very same thing. You know, if someone is depositing their money for a period of time, are they allowed to do something with it in the interim? And the law said no, basically, you can't.
Okay, let me ask the next question. We are looking for proxies for the basis. In other words, I don't think Sandeep subscribes to it. I certainly don't, that the basis is already falsified by government or bank intervention. There might have been efforts, but I don't think they succeeded. However, it is possible that in the future they will succeed. Now, in that case, we'll have to look for various proxies which we can use to make the same kind of analysis and try to have advance warning. So, I mentioned a few, and I am asking Sandeep if he could add to this list. Taking the ETFs, there is such a thing as NAV, that's net asset value per price, or the ratio of net asset value and price. This will convey the information to you whether the ETF, which is exchange traded fund, it's a warehouse really, but very convoluted structure, which could have a price, a share price, which you pay when you want to participate, which is over-represented or underrepresented by the holdings of gold. So that price will give you indication which is actually different from the basis, but it might have some information, if not by itself, then in combination with others. So this is one. ETF, talking about ETFs, the NAV to price ratio. There's another thing which is known as the call to put ratio. This is about options, gold or silver options. You calculate the outstanding, the open interest of the call options and compare it with the open interest, the put options of the same maturity, same commodity, and make various analysis. And so that's number two. Now, the third one, which I put on my list, is what I learned very recently from Brown yesterday, which is wonderful. I'm very, very pleased about this. The number of owners per ounce of COMEX gold. Who is doing the chart on this?
Nick Laird.
I can recommend it because I just find the idea brilliant. But it's on a subscription basis, right? You have to subscribe to service.
It's not expensive.
Not much. Okay. I wish tomorrow we'll have a little more time that you can elaborate on that. But I would put this as number 3 on the list. And then the differential quotient of the basis and the co-basis. In other words, you are not looking at the absolute number, but the change, the rate of change. And these 4, I think, are possible candidates, maybe in combination. Now, I would like to ask Sandeep to comment on this and add to it or subtract from it.
I think no, they're all valid complements to the basis. But the primary angle that I think that I'm going to pursue, instead of looking at COMEX futures, because don't forget COMEX futures, they're set at regular intervals and they expire at regular intervals and they're exchange traded, is to go directly to the bullion banks for a 1 week forward quote.
1 week?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very good. That's very good. So that means 5 business days.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. That's something that you have to call them up personally to ask. It's not something that they publish.
Certainly wouldn't publish.
They don't publish it.
But if you are a prospective client, then it's in their interest to keep you informed.
Yeah. And what we found actually, Bron and I were actually discussing it at the time, was that if you looked at the forward market directly at the beginning of the year, there was no sign of a direct backwardation, and it would be we were debating as to which would crack. You know, would the forward market come down to the futures market state, or would the futures market state go up to the forward market state?
What's the difference?
What do you mean?
Well, forward, future.
Forward is bespoke, and it's done at your choice of expiry.
It's like an English suit, isn't it?
Yes, well, it's like any suit. It's like an English suit, yeah. It's like an English suit. It's a bespoke contract. So you can say, I wanted to expire on the 25th of March 2010. You know. The point about it is that when you're looking at 1 week forward rates, and they give you the spread that's involved in that quote as well. When you're looking at 1 week forward rates, you don't have to deal with this annualization problem that you have with COMEX futures. So you have a consistently good and clear time series, really.
How often do you update this? Do you get a daily quote for a week forward, or you do it weekly?
You would get a daily quote. Yeah, you'd get a daily quote. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is off it a little bit, but is there any robust data currently collected about how many futures contracts are required to be settled in physical? And is that possibly a proxy that could be an interesting data point?
Well, we were watching that in December, and this goes back to Bron's point that he was making in one of his lectures, is that you can see how many contracts are up for who want delivery. You know, that's published on the COMEX website daily. But the point is that if Deutsche Bank is calling on HSBC for 1,000 ounces or 10,000 ounces of gold, it just goes from one end of the vault to the other. You know, so there's no actual gold leaving the system.
Which is the more important.
Which is the more important
proxy.
Yes.
And there is no data on it.
There is no data on it.
Is there any way there's no way to actually get that data, is there?
No, and I don't really want to phone up and ask them for that kind of data.
Is that from the SOS range?
Yes, basically. I imagine you just see total warehouse stocks, you know, registered eligible in the sub, you know, just on a sharp downtrend, you know, which we didn't really see in December. We saw the contracts up for tender increasing, but the actual the total level of warehouse stocks, there was no run, basically.
So is what we're talking about related to the chart we saw yesterday, where we saw that stocks in warehouse has been coming down since 2000, or is that something different?
That was Bron's chart, was it?
Which ones are you talking about? The registered stocks? Yeah, but that's only stuff that's put against a contract. I think you need to look at the total amount that's in that system and whether it's coming in or going out, really coming in or really going out. That's the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
I said to someone outside...
That's a proxy of the health or the faith of people in the system, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I said outside, I don't know who to, but my view is that if you put yourself in the shoes of the proprietary trader within a bullion bank, okay, they have access to lots of data, okay, and they can see all the buying and selling trading, but if the big people that they're trading against are just moving, title to bars is changing in London, but the bars are staying the same, you know, that's sort of, they get a feel for that. Their position on whether they're going to go long or short will completely change if they start to see bars leaving the vol. You know, because they know that if the bars are leaving default, that person, because if I'm a trader and for a bullion bank, I've got a large amount of allocated and someone's wanting to sell and I match them off to a buyer and the title changes, the fact that the buyer keeps it within the system tells me as the trader that they've got some sort of time frame that they're going to sell it again. But if that buyer takes those bars out, they're only going to do that if they're holding it for a really long time, because the costs of getting it back in, shipping it, blah, blah, blah. So that would be a signal to me as a trader to go, whoa, you know, that guy pulling it out, he's not going to come back too soon. So, you know, in some sense, pulling physical out of the system is the only thing that can really scare them.
I just think that although we're tiny players, that would be valuable, because that would really be an indicator of what's shaking. And sadly, we're at the retail end, and we don't know. You were marching around in the dark, getting back to what you said. The big guys just go in and grab with a big fist, and we're fiddling around in the dark like mushrooms, trying to figure out what's going on.
Now, we have so far 5 possible proxies for the basis. Briefly, the NAV to price ratio of the ETFs, call put ratio, number of owners per COMEX goal, that's number 3, differential quotient of bases and co-bases. Number 5 is the London Bullion Association 5-day forward rate. I suggested a number 6, which for the time being is not realistic, but it could become realistic. So let me say what this is. Bullion banks offer you 2 types of gold metal accounts. One is the allocated and the other is the unallocated account. And obviously they charge more for the allocated account. So you could take the ratio of these 2. But Sandy checked it out, and he's reporting to me that the difference is not that great, and the variation is not very important. However, we, I think, agree that it could become at one point. So it's worth watching. So let's add as number 6 to the list, which is the allocated and non-allocated metal account ratio as a possible proxy for the basis.
Wouldn't be Chicago
The rate of storage. The storage rate on those, or the amount?
Not the storage. No,
The amount.
you buy. You buy. You can either buy allocated or unallocated.
The
And there
premium
are
for
different locations for that. I think it's always the allocated which is more expensive, right? So,
Are you suggesting as a possible indicator, a 6th one, that the quantum of bullion that's allocated versus unallocated, or the different price for allocated versus unallocated?
different price.
Different price. Thank you.
If we could get the quanta, that would be much better though, but that's probably a lot.
Well, I'll sell you out.
Is that free to air?
Well, I may well press internally that we release that.
Yeah.
They're all very sensitive about these things, but this is transparency. So.
Now,
We're a small part of it.
time is approaching that we have to close this, but I have a last question to Sandeep. So I don't know how much time we have, but
Marcus, how much time do we have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes?
okay, then please invite more questions to the floor.
Questions?
Well, could I just ask Sandy Morales to start commenting on those other proxy measures, particularly the first one, which is one I can understand, which is this net asset value versus gold price ratio of ETF?
I haven't really, that's the first time I've heard about it, but it seems like a very, very sensible proxy, you know. But basis to me is something that's directly related to the business of warehousing, you know, and I want to stay as close to that as possible. But you need to think about potential ways of measuring the proxy, and that is a very good one. You know, it's a perfectly observable and time seriesable calculation.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah. I just want to ask your opinion on the influence on the basis by government, possible influence. What would happen if we put a tax, 30% tax for the bullion that you buy, to discourage people from buying gold and silver?
Well, that would, I don't know what that would do. You know, obviously the spot price would go to a premium. What that would do for the future price, I don't know. You know, whether that premium would be incorporated into that, you know, it depends, you know. But if they did introduce a tax like that, it would drive the market into a backwardation, I imagine, straight away, you know, so that wouldn't be something that they want to do. But they can influence the basis, you know. If you want to make, if you wanted to get the market back into that kind of state, you could buy futures. Okay, so just like they're monetizing government debt at the moment, you could monetize gold futures. But that is not a guaranteed way of suppressing the spot price. So you have to sell spot at some point as well. So whilst you can keep the high end of the future up, because there's no limit to the fiat currency out there, there is a limit to how much spot gold you can sell. So if this was government manipulation on the basis, it's not something that could last indefinitely. If it was something that was more natural, then it can last longer, you know. That's all you can say.
Sandy? Yeah, sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, sorry, we're going to have to stop here. There's going to be another function in here at 6, and the staff need to get the room ready. Sorry to do that.
Thank you.